Russia is now beholden to China. And I think one of the ironies, of course, is there's very similarity in the worldview between Putin and Xi. Putin has his Ruski Mir, the Russian world, re-establishing the old colonial borders of Russia, whereas Xi has the China dream, which is a similar sort of idea, but looking to reassert national greatness. And many of the nationalists in Beijing regard the rightful borders as the Qing dynasty borders, which of course include a good chunk of what is modern Russia. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ian Williams, an award-winning journalist and China expert. His latest book is called Vampire State: The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian's also been a foreign correspondent for NBC News and Channel 4 and previously worked for the Sunday Times, and over the years he's covered conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East and Ukraine. Ian, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good to be here.
I wanted to start with the kind of premise in your latest book, which is obviously relating to the Chinese economy. You call it a vampire state, and you assess the rise and the fall of the Chinese economy. To what extent has the Chinese economy been transformed for the worse over the past decade?
I think under Xi Jinping it stalled because the model which gave such phenomenal rates of growth for 4 decades simply isn't working anymore. It's outlived its usefulness. That model was based on massive investment in property and resulted in a property bubble, which is now bursting, massive and increasingly wasteful investment in infrastructure, a wave of cheap exports, particularly from the industrialized areas around the coastal regions of China. For many reasons, that simply is unsustainable. The world is more wary now about cheap and subsidized Chinese exports. Look at EVs and other technologies which they're pumping out to the world at subsidized prices. Also, there is a question mark about whether Xi Jinping is capable of making the transition to a better quality of economic output, an economy driven by innovation, an economy driven more by consumption, because all that assumes giving more power to Chinese entrepreneurs, to the market, to individuals, which runs counter to everything that Xi Jinping stands for, his priority having been control and security.
I mean, 10 years ago, a lot of people thought it wouldn't be long, probably at some point in the 2020s, that the Chinese economy would overtake the US economy in terms of size. Is that now off the table?
That was seen as inevitable. It was very hard to have a conversation with any strategist or economist that wouldn't tell you that China becoming the world's biggest economy was an inevitability. In fact, by some measures, it already is. But now that is receding into the distant future, and it's very hard to see that will happen anytime soon. At the very least, we're seeing stagnation, which is often compared with what happened in Japan during its lost decades. At the most, we may see the economy hitting the buffers quite hard, all of which has implications for the party, which has really based its legitimacy on its ability to deliver prosperity and its ability to deliver stability.
That's a really interesting point, and I want to come on to the political implications of a stalling Chinese economy in a moment. To what extent, Ian, have, for example, the tariffs that first the Trump administration and then the Biden administration have imposed on Chinese goods, to what extent has that contributed to this stalling Chinese economy?
It has contributed, but I don't think it's the decisive factor. I think the decisive factor is the economy being unsustainable in its current form. The current model simply doesn't work anymore and needs to be changed. Even Chinese economists would tell you that. But of course, the obstacle is Xi's obsession with security, with party power, which runs contrary to the prescriptions that most economists give for what is necessary. But certainly the sanctions, the tariffs have played a part. Because China no longer has access to world-class technology such as computer chips, for instance. There are aims to restrict AI. And I think the Americans and others in the West have concluded that increasingly this technology is being used by the military, by the security apparatus, and therefore it was given, and that combined with the fact that that there's never been a level playing field in China for foreign companies, but increasingly they've been discriminated against. It's become a much more hostile environment for foreign companies to do business. All of these factors contributed to the tariffs, the sanctions, which arguably were long overdue. I mean, it's been pretty clear for quite some time that there was not a level playing field in China, but it took the West, I think, a long time to wake up to the reality, particularly under Xi Jinping.
So what is the impact of the stalling Chinese economy on Xi Jinping personally, but also on the Chinese Communist Party more broadly?
I think the impact could be quite profound, which is why we're now seeing desperate efforts to stimulate the economy, which I don't think are going to work because it misses the fundamental point about it. But it goes to this unwritten contract, as it's sometimes called, between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people that, yes, we'll deliver continuing and quite staggering rates of growth. Your personal life will improve, your economic opportunities will get better. And we'll provide political stability. But in exchange for that, we want docility when it comes to politics. We don't want people questioning the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, with the economy stalling, with the property crisis, with massive youth unemployment, that contract is an increasingly difficult one to sustain. Now, internationally, there are also implications for Xi and for the party, because China's been able over the last decade in particular to expand through its Belt and Road Initiative, to invest internationally. And it's very much taken the line, look, this economy is like an express train and everybody wants to jump on it while it's moving so fast. But when it stalls, the ability of China, the ability of the economy to seduce, if you like, becomes much more difficult. And many countries in the world are essentially as transactional as the Chinese Communist Party. And they want to get out of it what they can. And they see this international competition now increasingly vigorous between the West and China. And they will play it for all it's worth to get the best opportunities they can to leverage this competition to their own benefit. And so this is challenging for China. And then in another aspect, the massive rates of growth have enabled China to massively expand and modernize its military, and also to modernize its economy. And when money becomes more scarce, that becomes more difficult. So for all these reasons, the position of Xi and the party becomes much more challenging as the economy faces greater difficulties.
I mean, do you think it is in any way realistic, maybe not immediately because he seems pretty secure, but maybe in 5 years' time, if the economy is still stagnant, that Xi's personal position could come under threat?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything's possible. I remember interviewing not so long ago Ai Weiwei, the exiled Chinese artist, and I asked him precisely that question. And he said sometimes, if you look at Chinese history, when the emperor has appeared to be at their strongest, they've been at their weakest. And yes, he looks very powerful. He systematically has eliminated opposition. But if you look at merely over the last year or so, the disappearance of the foreign minister, the disappearance of the defense minister, several senior generals in the rocket force, which is the elite of the PLA. This is not a sign of a stable system, and it's not a sign of a system which is without dissent and unease. How will that play out? That's very difficult to tell. But I do think that anything is possible, particularly when you look at the way the economy is stalling at the moment.
What do you think the impact will be on the wider world? And in particular, the long-standing fear that China could launch an invasion of Taiwan. I was speaking recently to Robin Niblett, the former director of Chatham House, and he said he thinks that a weaker Chinese economy is worse for the world in the long term because the Chinese Communist Party feels some need to reassert its strength, and that could lead to, for example, an invasion of Taiwan. Do you think that is a realistic assessment? I
think it is very realistic because already the Communist Party is effectively a nationalist party, and it is an increasingly rabid nationalist party, this breed of sort of Han nationalist feeling, which resents anything which is different, whether this is the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, whether it is Taiwan trying to assert its separate and unique identity and culture. And I think that there will be a temptation, we see it everywhere with autocrats under pressure, that when you face economic difficulties, you resort to nationalist rhetoric, you resort to chauvinism. On the one hand, I think an invasion of Taiwan would be very difficult along conventional means. It would just be well signposted. It would take such a large contingent of soldiers and equipment. Taiwan is not an easy place to invade for multiple reasons, but arguably an invasion of sorts is already taking place through grey means, whether these are cyber attacks, endless military harassment, disinformation, misinformation warfare. This is a day-to-day reality for Taiwan. But I do think there is a danger that the nationalism could be stepped up, could be ramped up as the economic difficulties grow greater.
Hello, it's James here. Sorry to interrupt today's episode of Frontline. We'll be right back in just a moment, but I wanted to tell you about our brand new YouTube channel called Times Radio History, and in particular, our flagship programme, History Undone. Each week, we take a different iconic moment from history and replay it, asking what the long-term consequences would have been had things played out differently. And our latest episode is all about the Battle of Monte Cassino, part of the Italian campaign in 1944. And as ever, we got some top guests. Our regular panellist, the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and the brilliant historian, broadcaster and author James Holland. So check it out. It's History Undone. It's on Times Radio History. Please subscribe. And what lessons, if any, do you think Xi Jinping is learning from the war in Ukraine and the West's response to Russian aggression?
I think he wants to make his economy more resilient. He wants to make it more sanction-proof. On the one hand, he's also looking at the missteps of the Russian military, because the PLA in many ways is modelled on the Russian military. And he's looking at the mistakes that they made throughout the invasion. He's looking to see how the PLA can learn from that. I mean, when I was in Taiwan last, they were saying that the road from Russia to Kiev, which was very much where the Russian army was badly defeated, their equivalent, they say, is a Taiwan Strait. Let's see what happens when they try and come down there in large numbers. But I think China militarily is looking at the tactics of Russia and how they can learn from that. And also, and perhaps more importantly for Xi, he's looking for ways that he can sanction-proof the economy, that he can make the economy more resilient, so that it can resist the sort of pressure which has been put on Russia.
How would you assess relations between China and Russia currently? I mean, we had the BRICS summit last week in Russia itself. Is it a kind of marriage of convenience currently? How would you assess the relationship?
I think it is a marriage of convenience, but that makes it no less dangerous. I think that the war in Ukraine would not be possible without the support that China is giving Russia. I mean, China is effectively underwriting Russia's hostility.
Even though it technically says it's neutral, but that's bogus as far as you're concerned.
It would not be possible without the financial and economic support that China is providing through extra trade, through the purchases of oil and gas. China is giving diplomatic cover to Russia. It's repeating, it's parroting Russian reasons for the invasion, Russian propaganda for it. There is a line, if you like, where China has stepped very close to, but not over, in supplying weapons, although dual-use equipment, whether this be chips or machine tools, have been supplied to Russia. So I think that this notion of neutrality is a fig leaf, but I think it suits China at the moment because it diverts Western attention to Europe rather than to the Asia Pacific, and it also has cemented China's position as by far the superior partner in that relationship. I mean, Russia is now beholden to China. And I think one of the ironies, of course, is there's very similarity in the worldview between Putin and Xi. Putin has his Ruski Mir, the Russian world, re-establishing the old colonial borders of Russia, whereas Xi has the China Dream, which is a similar sort of idea, but looking to reassert national greatness. And many of the nationalists in Beijing regard the rightful borders as the Qing dynasty borders, which of course include a good chunk of what is modern Russia. So it'd be interesting to see how that works out.
Could you see a scenario, Ian, in which Xi Jinping calls up Vladimir Putin and essentially says, call off the war in Ukraine? I mean, I'm just wondering, for instance, and this is a big if, obviously we're a week out from the US election, let's say Kamala Harris were to win, and let's say Xi says, okay, in exchange for calling off the trade war between the US and China, we need you to basically, have a word with Vladimir Putin. Do you think that's a realistic scenario at all?
I think it's realistic to say that China could pressure Russia into negotiations or another end to the war. But I think it's very unlikely that they will, because I think China gets too much out of it. I think there are certain red lines, nuclear weapons being one, and I suspect there is some unease in Beijing about the involvement of North Korean soldiers, because the knock-on effects of that are potentially quite significant. One being, of course, the desire by Japan and South Korea to bolster their links with the US, to bolster their own security stance, which may emerge from this, which China will not be happy with. And China's always regarded North Korea as a sort of essential buffer state, as an area of its own influence. So I think there are many areas where Beijing are uneasy and where they may restrain Russia, but I don't think that would include actively pressuring Putin to end the war.
Just to go back to the title of your new book, you called China the vampire state. What do you mean by that?
Well, this was inspired by a book that came out in 1939. It was written by a German, he was an economist but also an author. His pen name was Gunther Reimann. And he wrote a book called The Vampire Economy, Doing Business Under Fascism. And it was about how the Nazi Party bent the economy and business to its will, whether this was through coercion or, in many cases, collaboration by a lot of companies with the Nazis. And I was amazed and struck by going through that book, how you could put a line through Nazi Party and replace it with Chinese Communist Party. And seamlessly, it would read like a contemporary book about the Chinese economy. So that was the inspiration for it. But I also think it's a very good way of looking at it, because it is this vampire, this bloodsucker, who is drawing in all these resources, who through coercion, through predatory practices, is very much taking advantage of companies and economies which have been quite naive in their dealings with China over the years.
We're talking of vampires. We're recording this in the week of Halloween. Do you want to tell us what's happening in China around Halloween?
Yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, Halloween is big in China. It sometimes surprises people that it is. And there are costume parties, some of which are officially sanctioned. But this week, the police in Shanghai and other cities have been busy stopping gatherings of people in fancy dress, leading away, arresting Superman, Batman, Donald Trump with a plaster on his ear. And the reason for this is to stop a repeat of last year, when the costumes included a surveillance camera and people in hazmat uniforms parodying the fairly brutal lockdown that happened during the COVID pandemic. And the authorities don't want to see a repeat of that. So they are physically preventing gatherings around China of people in fancy dress, and also trying to prevent the proliferation of memes and wordplay on the Chinese internet, which has become a key technique of internet users in China as a way of having discussions and sidestepping the draconian censorship laws. Now, that leads to another element of what's happening, which, of course, China is trying to upgrade the Great Firewall, its system of censorship, and there have been new directives to try and stop the proliferation of memes, the proliferation of wordplay, to get round these controls. So it's interesting in itself that the party should feel so paranoid and fearful about, spooked, shall we say, by Halloween, that it is actively stopping these gatherings. But it's also a test of these new controls on the internet, which trying to stop an area, a loophole, which has been quite actively exploited by those still trying to maintain a degree of freedom of expression.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. And on the point about COVID, is there any sense within the Chinese Communist Party, which I appreciate as an organisation is probably not great at self-criticism and self-reflection, but is there any sense that they dropped the ball over COVID and they overreacted, and that their draconian lockdowns and measures and limitations on people's freedoms harmed the Chinese economy and Chinese society?
It did. It harmed both. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that the lockdown, the restrictions, which were the most draconian in the world, had a very bad effect on the economy and on confidence within China. I think that you will never get them to admit that, and people are very cautious in China about criticising the party. But there's no doubt, I think, that there were serious issues, that the economy was hit badly. There was an assumption that the economy would emerge from COVID and would bounce back quite quickly. That was the assumption of a lot of Western economists. But that hasn't happened because the economic issues that China faces are too fundamental. And it wasn't just about COVID, but COVID certainly played an impact, and I think it also quite badly hit confidence. And one of the things that's lacking at the moment in China, whether it's among consumers or among companies, is confidence in the economic management of the country. There's always been this notion that, China's a technocratic society. Unlike us, it can think long term. We put the technocrats in charge. Well, that's fine as long as you've got someone that will listen to the technocrats, because it doesn't matter how good your civil servants are, how good your technocrats are. If you've got an emperor who only wants to hear what he wants to hear, then it doesn't matter about the quality of the information that's being passed to that person if they don't act upon it.
Just finally, we are less than a week away now from the US presidential election. If you are the Chinese Communist Party, what is your preferred outcome from that?
I think that's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one, because who do you opt for? Trump won. He began as a big fan of the autocrats. He said very positive things about Putin, about Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, about Xi. But later in his presidency, he completely changed the conversation about China. Of course, when Biden came to power, he continued those sanctions, those tariffs, and in fact intensified them. And the chances are that Harris would continue that Biden policy. I think Trump is more of an unknown. He has threatened massive increases in tariffs, but would he go through with that? A positive for Beijing is that the more Trump alienates his allies and undermines alliances, that's a positive for China. That's something which is good. But how do you balance that against the potential intensification of, he's a wild card to China. Who knows what's going to come along? So I think perhaps there might be a preference more for Biden continuity, because at least you know what you're dealing with, than the uncertainty of a Trump presidency.
And potentially, I've heard some people say that, for example, what Russia really wants, even though, yes, probably Russia would rather have Trump, and maybe you're right, maybe the Chinese Communist Party would rather have Harris on balance. But what both of them really want is a kind of very fractious, divided country. They want controversy over the legitimacy of the election results. Any kind of internal dissent in America is good for China and it's good for Russia.
Absolutely. That's the key bottom line. One of the mantras of both the Russians and the Chinese is that the West is in decline. It's split, it's decadent, its time is over. And the more that happens in Washington, in Europe, to support that thesis is a plus for both countries. So divisiveness is what they're after, and it's just a question of what outcome is most likely to bolster that for them.
Ian, as ever, a pleasure to speak to you. Ian's new book is called Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian Williams, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.